largest desert on Earth is a graveyard, not because people died there, though many did. Because an entire living world died there, slowly, over thousands of years, and the sand you see today is what settled on top of it. Everything you think you know about where Egypt came from starts with that death, and Egypt spent 3,000 years making sure you would never hear about it. 12,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. That is not poetry, and it is not exaggeration. Grasslands, rivers, lakes thick with fish, giraffes and hippos and crocodiles moving through territory that today burns above 50 degrees and receives less rain in a year than you get in a single afternoon storm. People lived there, thousands of them, and then the water started leaving. So here is the question that should bother you. How does the destruction of an entire habitable world become the foundation of the longest-lasting civilization in human history? Not the aftermath of it, not the recovery from it, the foundation. The thing that made Egypt possible was the thing that made Egypt necessary, and almost nobody tells that story. Think about what that means for the version you were taught. Pyramids, pharaohs, gods with animal heads, a civilization that seems to appear fully formed on the banks of a river. That version starts the clock at the finish line. The real beginning has no monuments, no kings, no writing. It has families packing what they could carry and walking east because the lake they were born beside had turned to dust. And there is something else buried in that sand, something the Egyptians themselves worked very hard to bury. They told the world they were pure, untouched, a people who rose from the Nile and owed nothing to anyone. The archaeology says something different, and what it says is uncomfortable enough that it was written out of their own official story before the first pyramid was ever imagined. Start with why the desert was evergreen, because the reason is stranger than the fact. The Earth wobbles, its orbit shifts in cycles that take tens of thousands of years, and the astronomer Milutin Milankovitch worked out the mathematics of that wobble in the 20th century. 12,000 years ago, that tilt pushed African monsoon rains far north of where they reach today. That single astronomical accident turned the Sahara into a habitable continent within a continent, and the people who lived in it were not primitive in any way that matters. They knew flint, bows, traps, basketry, early pottery. They tracked animal migrations across seasons. They had language, ritual, art, complex kinship. Cognitively, they were you, living in a world that was about to disappear beneath their feet. You can still see their world, which is the part that unsettles people. In southeastern Algeria, at Tassili Najer, there are more than 15,000 engravings and paintings spread across hundreds of kilometers of sandstone plateau. Herders driving cattle, families beside water, women gathering. All of it painted in a place where nothing has lived for millennia. Nobody painted those animals from imagination. You do not invent a hippopotamus. Those images are eyewitness accounts, and they sit today in one of the driest places on the planet, surrounded by nothing, addressed to no one. The gap between what is on that rock and what surrounds that rock is the clearest evidence humans have ever left that the world can end without anyone declaring it over. Around 6,000 years before our era, the monsoons began pulling south. Understand the speed of this, because the speed is the cruelty. Nothing collapsed overnight. A lake reached slightly less far than your grandfather remembered. A plain carried a little more sand than it did when you were a child. Loss arrived generation by generation, slow enough that no single person could name the day it began. For 1,000 years, maybe two, those populations fought it with everything they had. They chased the last pockets of moisture. They shifted from hunting toward herding because animals you own are more reliable than animals you find. They developed ways to store water and food. Every one of those adaptations worked, and every one of them only bought time. By 4,000 years before our era, the Central Sahara was finished. There was no version of staying. Some moved south toward the savannas below the desert, and some moved east toward the only water in that entire quarter of the world that did not care whether it rained. A river fed by mountains 1,000 kilometers away, flooding on schedule every year without fail. The archaeologist Karl Butzer described this in the 1970s, and the researcher Fekri Hassan spent decades refining it. They called the Green Sahara an incubator. For thousands of years, it held separate populations, developing separately, solving different problems in different landscapes. Then it dried, and every one of those separate solutions was funneled into the same narrow valley at the same time. This is the detail that changes everything, and it is the detail that Egypt later erased. Egypt was not founded by a people, it was founded by peoples, plural, who had spent millennia apart and arrived as strangers to each other. The most culturally unified civilization the ancient world produced began as a collision of refugees who did not share a home, a history, or in all probability, a language. If you are finding this the kind of history you were never given, subscribe here because this is exactly the kind of story we rebuild from the ground up here, all the way through. What they found when they reached the valley had no equivalent anywhere they had come from. Every year between June and September, the river swelled, driven by monsoon rain falling on the Ethiopian highlands and pouring down the Blue Nile and the Atbara. It flooded the land, and when it withdrew, it left behind a layer of black silt so fertile that farming there barely qualified as work. Farmers everywhere else on Earth fought their soil. They rotated crops, hauled manure, left fields to rest for years, watched land die under them anyway. Farmers on the Nile waited for the river to finish and then planted. The Egyptians named that black soil Kemet and named the sterile red desert around it Deshret, and the entire dualism of their cosmology grew out of a color difference you could see with your eyes. Now follow the consequence, because the consequence is the whole civilization. When a society grows more food than it needs to survive, it produces surplus. Surplus means not everyone has to farm. And the moment some people stop farming, you get tool makers, potters, builders, healers, people who watch the stars, people who manage the distribution of grain, people who perform rituals. That is specialization, and specialization is the entire foundation of what we call complexity. The river did not simply feed the people who came to it, it bought them time, and time is the rarest commodity in the ancient world. Every invention Egypt is famous for exists because a flood did the hardest agricultural labor for free once a year for 3,000 years. But surplus creates a problem nobody in those first villages could have predicted. If the granary holds more than the village needs, someone has to decide who gets it, and the person who decides that stops being a neighbor. That is the seed of everything that follows, and within a few centuries it produces men buried with treasure while their neighbors are buried with nothing. The oldest culture we can see clearly in the valley is the Badarian, named for the Badari region in Upper Egypt, appearing around 5,500 years before our era. Sit with that number, 75 centuries ago. 3,000 years before anyone stacked the first pyramid, in a landscape with no kings, no writing, and no Egypt in any sense you would recognize. 3,000 years is a distance most people cannot feel, so here is a way to feel it. Between you and the Roman Empire there are roughly 2,000 years. Between the Badarians and the Great Pyramid there is more time than that. Those farmers were more distant from the pyramids than Rome is distant from you, and they were already Egyptian in the way that mattered. They grew wheat and barley, they kept cattle, sheep and goats, they made a black-topped pottery of a technical quality that still surprises specialists, fired so that the interior turned black and the exterior red with a consistency that is difficult to reproduce deliberately. They worked native copper, ivory, semi-precious stone. None of that is the part that should stop you. The part that should stop you is how they buried their dead. Bodies laid facing west, toward the setting sun, toward the place where the sun dies every evening and returns every morning, without explanation and without fail. 7,000 years ago, before writing, before priests, before any temple existed anywhere in that valley, somebody decided that death was a direction, and that the direction was survivable. You know what grew out of that idea? Pyramid texts, coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, mummification, an entire industry of eternity that lasted 3 millennia and still fills museums today. Every documentary treats that obsession as something the pharaohs invented, a theological system built by elites for elites. It was not. It was inherited, and the people it was inherited from had no elites at all. The pharaohs did not invent the Egyptian preoccupation with death and resurrection. They found it already ancient, already embedded in how ordinary farmers arranged bodies in the ground, and they built a state on top of it. That is a different kind of history. It means the deepest idea in Egyptian civilization came from below, not above, and was already thousands of years old when the first king claimed it. After the Badarians come, the culture's archaeologists group as the Naqada period, named for a site in Upper Egypt excavated by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie at the end of the 19th century. Petrie was one of the founders of scientific archaeology, the first to date sites systematically by their layers, and what he pulled out of that ground did not match anything anyone expected to find. He was digging beneath the dynasties, expecting something simple underneath them. He found a complex society instead. Long-distance trade, sophisticated art, power structures already forming. Centuries before the first pharaoh, in a period that officially did not exist yet, there was something in Upper Egypt that already behaved like the beginning of a state. Naqada 1 runs roughly from 4,000 to 3,500 years before our era, and its pottery is painted with boats. Not small boats. Vessels with many oars, crewed, loaded, moving. That detail reframes the entire river. The Nile was never only water and silt. It was a road, running the full length of the country, and those villages were already using it as one. The objects tell you how far that road reached. Ivory, copper, carnelian and turquoise from sources hundreds of kilometers away, and in the cemeteries something new and permanent appears. Some graves are larger, some hold more goods, some hold almost nothing at all. Inequality is not a later corruption of Egyptian society, it arrives with the society itself. Naqada 2, between 3,500 and 3,200 years before our era, is where the archaeological record visibly accelerates. Settlements grow, luxury goods multiply in elite burials. Trade networks stretch to Nubia in the south, Sinai in the east, Libya in the west, the Mediterranean Levant in the north. And then something appears that changes the nature of power entirely. Seals, administrative labels, marks of ownership. Somebody has begun keeping track of who holds what and how much and for how long. That sounds bureaucratic and dull until you realize what it actually means. It means memory has become an instrument of control, and that whoever controls the record controls the argument about what is owed and to whom. Now here is the part of Naqada 2 that rarely makes it into the popular story, and it is the reason the Egyptians later built a wall around their own origins. In this period, objects and motifs start appearing in Egypt that are not Egyptian. Confronted animals facing each other, fantastic beasts with long necks intertwined, mud brick architecture with recessed niches in the facade. Every one of those has a direct parallel in Mesopotamia, in the Uruk culture, which in exactly that period was expanding across the Near East, planting trading colonies and pushing its techniques and its symbols of power from Iran to the Mediterranean. Two river civilizations, separated by a distance that looks impossible on a map, showing each other's fingerprints at precisely the same moment. And this is not inference from decoration alone. In the Negev Desert, in what is now southern Israel, there is a site called En Besor, where archaeologists found a colony of Mesopotamian merchants active during Naqada 2, physically present, trading with groups from the Nile Valley, carrying goods, techniques, and ideas in both directions along a route that everyone assumes did not exist yet. Be careful with what this means because it is easy to overstate. Egypt did not copy Mesopotamia, and Egyptians were not Mesopotamian. What happened looks like contact, commercial and intellectual, flowing both ways. Egypt took certain motifs, transformed them, folded them into a symbolic universe entirely its own, and produced something nobody would mistake for anything else. But the story Egypt eventually told about itself had no room for any of that. Pure, isolated, self-generated, born from the Nile and indebted to no one on earth. That narrative was a construction, built later, maintained for millennia, and it worked so well that it still shapes how the civilization is taught today. The evidence in the ground says the opposite. Around 3,300 years before our era, in late Naqada 2, the first recognizable hieroglyphic signs appear. They come from Abydos, from an elite burial in the cemetery known as U, where more than 200 small tablets of ivory and bone were recovered. The German archaeologist Günther Dreyer read them as the earliest steps toward Egyptian writing. And what do the first written signs in Egyptian history say? Nothing about gods, nothing about kings, nothing about the afterlife those farmers had been preparing for over 3,000 years. They are accounts, quantities, goods, ownership. The first thing anyone in that valley bothered to write down was who had how much of what. Understand why that matters, because it tells you exactly what kind of society was forming. Writing did not appear because someone wanted to preserve a story. It appeared because the volume of transactions had passed the limit of human memory. Too many goods, too many people, too many obligations. Writing is not the birth of literature. It is a prosthetic for a system that had outgrown the brains running it. By that same period, there was a city in Upper Egypt called Nekhen, which the Greeks later renamed Hierakonpolis. Several square kilometers of settlement, and a population some researchers put between 5 and 10,000 at its height, around 3,300 years before our era. In a world of villages, that is not a large town. That is something without precedent. Nekhen made pottery at scale and brewed beer at scale, industrially, in quantities no household would ever need. It held the oldest temple documented anywhere in Egypt. It had elites living in larger houses built from better materials, and craftsmen who never farmed because somebody else grew what they ate. Every structural feature of a state is present there before any state officially exists. And then there is the cemetery. Excavations at Hierakonpolis uncovered burials of animals that have no business being buried anywhere: lions, leopards, hippopotami, elephants, baboons. Some interred with collars, some with jewelry, laid in the ground beside the tombs of the human elite, cared for in death the way you would care for a person. Those animals were not hunted trophies. They were kept, fed, maintained alive for years at enormous cost by people who had to catch a hippopotamus before they could own one. The elite of Nekhen ran a private menagerie of the most dangerous creatures in their world, and when they died, they took part of it with them into the ground. Read what that says, because it was written to be read. I can feed a lion, I can hold an elephant. The wild does not frighten me, it obeys me. Power over untamable nature stated as power over you. 4,000 years before Roman emperors put lions in an arena to make the same claim, the lords of Nekhen had already worked out the entire grammar of it. While the south was building this, the north was building something else, and the two barely resembled each other. The delta was not a valley. It was a maze of channels, marshland, and extraordinarily fertile ground, opening directly onto the Mediterranean. Different landscape, different problems, different people. The country you know as Egypt was, at this point, not one country in any sense. The Mahdi culture near what is now Cairo and the Bhutto culture further north produced far less monumental architecture and far less elaborate funerary art than the south. What they produced instead was contact. Canaanite storage jars in delta sites, objects of Syrian origin, imported ceramic techniques. The north was outward-facing, mercantile, plugged into a sea the southerners had never seen. So picture the country honestly. In the south, kings consolidating power through ritual, monument, and burial looking inward toward Africa. In the north, traders looking outward toward the Levant and the Mediterranean, richer in connections than in tombs. Two worlds, two economies, two orientations, joined only by the fact that the same water ran through both of them. The unification you learned as a single event was nothing of the kind. It took at least 2 or 3 generations of military expansion and political maneuver. The southern kings pushed north through force, through marriage alliances with local elites, and above all through the seizure of something the north had and the south wanted very badly. Follow the money, because the money explains the war. The Delta controlled access to the Mediterranean, to the copper and turquoise of Sinai, to the cedar of Lebanon, to Levantine oil and wine. Everything the South needed to build monuments and reward followers arrived through northern hands. Conquest was not about unity. Unity was the story told afterwards about a supply chain. The earliest kings we can actually name sound like nobody you have heard of. Irihor, Ke, Scorpion the First. Those are not mythical figures invented by later priests. They are signs on pottery fragments, on ivory tablets, in the remains of elite tombs at Abydos. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford holds inscriptions of Ka. The Cairo Museum holds pieces of Irihor. They existed, they ruled real territory, and their names survived precisely because writing had just been invented for the purpose of recording ownership. The first people in history to be permanently named were named by an accounting system. Everyone who lived and died in that valley across the preceding 7,000 years is anonymous, and always will be. There is an object that shows you exactly how those kings sold themselves. The scorpion mace head found at Hierakonpolis and held in the Ashmolean shows a pre-dynastic king holding a hoe, opening an irrigation canal in what appears to be a ceremony marking the start of the agricultural season. Around the scene, standards with birds hanging from them read as conquered or allied peoples. Look at what that image claims. The king is not commanding the harvest. The king is the mechanism that makes the harvest possible. The canal, the flood, the food on the table, all of it flows through his body. That is an argument, and it is a devastatingly effective one, because it makes political power indistinguishable from the natural order. Now consider how you would rebel against that. Opposing a king is a political act. Opposing the principle that makes water reach the fields is something else entirely, closer to arguing with the sun. In 4 or 5 centuries, the people of that valley went from farmers dividing surplus to subjects who could not conceive of the state's absence. That is the real invention. The figure who closes the process is Narmer, who probably reigned around 3,100 years before our era, and the object that carries his name is the single most important artifact in all of pre-dynastic Egypt. It is not a monument or a tomb, it is a slab of siltstone about 63 centimeters tall, and it is essentially a poster. The narmer palette was found at Hierakonpolis in 1898 by James Quibble and Frederick Green, and it sits today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. On one face, the king wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and strikes a kneeling enemy, while the falcon god Horus presents him with 6,000 captives of the north, rendered as heads and papyrus flowers. Turn it over and the message shifts. Now the king wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, walking past the decapitated bodies of his defeated enemies, counting them. The gods approve. The victory is total. The enemies are not merely beaten, they are unmade. Every element of it is chosen, and every element is doing political work. But the loudest thing that palette says is the thing that looks like a detail. The same man wears both crowns. Not a southern conqueror ruling occupied territory. A king who belongs to both lands and always did. That is not a record of what happened. It is a claim about what should be understood to have happened, and it is astonishingly sophisticated for its moment. Narmer conquered, and then Narmer explained the conquest. He understood something most rulers in history had to learn the hard way, that holding power and narrating power are 2 separate jobs, and the second one lasts longer. The palette outlived his army, his kingdom, his dynasty, and his language, and it is still doing its job in a display case today. There is a complication worth explaining, because it shows how fragile the official record is. Later, Egyptian king lists credit unification to a ruler called Menes, first pharaoh of the first dynasty. The archaeology from the period itself points to Narmer. Toby Wilkinson of Cambridge, among many others, holds that they are the same man, or that Menes was the throne name Narmer took. That solution has political logic behind it. If you are the first king of a unified country, the last thing you want is to keep the name you carried when you ruled only half of it. Egyptian kingship used multiple names deliberately, one for the god, one for the throne. Even the founder's identity was an editorial decision, and later scribes edited it again. What the archaeology cannot show directly, but what can be inferred with real confidence, is that unification was violent. Not everywhere, and not continuously, but elite burials from the transition carry something that does not appear in earlier periods, and once you know it is there, it is difficult to look at the birth of Egypt the same way again. In the tomb of Aha, one of the first pharaohs of the first dynasty at Abydos, excavators found secondary burials. Dozens of young people laid out around the king, apparently servants or members of the court, apparently killed to accompany him. Not casualties of war, not victims of disease. Retainers, taken from the living so the dead man would not arrive alone. Researchers call it retainer sacrifice, and here is the strangest part of it. The practice lasted roughly 2 generations and then stopped completely, vanishing from Egyptian culture as though it had never been thought of. Nobody knows why. Perhaps the Shabti figurines of later tombs replaced real bodies with symbolic ones. Perhaps it simply cost too much in wealth or in loyalty. Whatever the reason, the meaning of it doesn't go away. The Egyptian state that would later present itself as eternal order, cosmic balance, and perfect continuity was founded on a practice its own descendants found unspeakable enough to erase. The serenity you associate with Egyptian civilization is real. It is also the second draft. The first dynasty spans 8 kings across more than 2 centuries, ending around 2890 before our era. Narmer, Aha, Jer, Jet, Den, Anajib, Semerket, Qua. Across those reigns, writing becomes systematic, Administration grows dense, foreign trade intensifies, and the ideology of sacred kingship hardens into something instantly recognizable as Egyptian. Under Den, the record finally opens up precisely because writing had matured enough to produce real administrative text. The Palermo stone, a fragment of royal annals, preserves military expeditions to Sinai, religious ceremonies, flood levels of the Nile, and administrative data. It is a narrow window, but it is a direct one, into what governing actually consisted of. And inside Den's reign sits a name that should be far more famous than it is. Mernith, almost certainly his mother, held power as regent while the king was too young to rule. Her tomb at Abydos is comparable in scale to the royal tombs around it. A stela carries her name. A seal impression lists her among kings. By any functional measure, Mernith governed Egypt more than 2,000 years before Hatshepsut, more than 3,000 before Cleopatra. The first woman known to have ruled the state that would define kingship for the ancient world, and she is a footnote, remembered mainly by specialists in a country obsessed with recording its own greatness. Then the cracks show. Anegib's reign carries signs of revolt or unresolved tension in Lower Egypt, the north still not fully pacified generations after the conquest, and his successor Semerkhet did something to him that in Egyptian terms was worse than defeat. He had Anegib's name scraped off monuments. Understand what erasing a name meant in that culture. To speak a name was to sustain existence. To remove it was not censorship but annihilation, the deletion of a person from the fabric of the world, forever. The Romans practiced damnatio memoriae and gave it a Latin phrase. The Egyptians were doing it 1,000 years earlier, to their own kings. The retaliation came immediately. Later tradition, preserved by the priest Manetho in the 3rd century before our era, treated Semerkhet as illegitimate, possibly a usurper, and the next pharaoh, Ka, ordered Anegib's name restored on several monuments while removing Semerkhet's. 2 kings, 2 erasures, each one undoing the other. The Eternal Order was already fighting over its own record. The Second Dynasty is the part of Egyptian history almost nobody talks about, and it is the part where the whole thing nearly came apart. Hotep-Sekemwi, Nebra, Ninetcher, Weneg, Senej, Seth-Peribsen, Kasekemwi. Some of those names barely register in the archaeological record at all. Several of their principal tombs have never been securely identified, which for a dynasty of pharaohs is remarkable in itself. Ninetcher ruled for decades, judging by the Palermo stone, and appears to have run into serious trouble near the end. Indirect evidence has led some researchers to argue that he divided the country between 2 heirs before dying. Whether or not that is exactly what happened, what followed it was the darkest and most revealing stretch of early Egyptian history. Because one pharaoh of that dynasty did something that has no parallel anywhere else. Seth-Peribsen replaced Horus in his royal name with Set. Set was the god of chaos, of the desert, of storms, the murderer of Osiris. A king writing that god above his own name is not a minor liturgical adjustment. It reads on its face like a declaration of war on the state religion. Later Egyptians read it as heresy or usurpation, and that reading survived for millennia. The reality is probably more interesting. Set was the protector god of Upper Egypt before unification, and Peribsen may have been reaching backwards for southern legitimacy at a moment when the unified state was fracturing. A king does not invoke the god of chaos unless the order is already gone. Whatever he intended, the country tore, and the man who put it back together was Kasekemwi, the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, whose name means the 2 powers appear. Both symbols sit in it, Horus and Set together in the royal name deliberately, where for 2 centuries only one had ever been permitted to stand. Read that as the political statement it was. The war is over. Neither side lost. We are one thing again. It is an act of reconciliation of remarkable elegance, and it is almost certainly the work of a man who had to win that peace on a battlefield first, because the bases of his own statues tell you exactly what it cost. Those statue bases found at Hierakonpolis and held in the Ashmolean and in Cairo show fallen enemies with numbers inscribed beside them, 47,209 in one, 48,205 in another. The figures may well be inflated. What they cannot be is invented from nothing. Egypt fought a civil war large enough to count in tens of thousands. And here is where the whole story closes on itself. Kasekemwi built the Shunet El Zabib at Abydos, a mud brick funerary enclosure with walls approaching 11 meters, still standing 4,700 years later. He was probably the father or stepfather of Djoser. One generation after the Civil War, Imhotep stacked 6 shrinking mastabas into 62 meters of limestone, and Egypt began building in stone forever. That leap only worked because everything underneath it was already there, and everything underneath it came from people running out of water. The Sahara emptied, strangers collided on one river, and 3,000 years later, Rome absorbed their gods instead of destroying them. Nobody planned it. If this changed how you see where civilizations come from, subscribe here so the next ones find you.